We live in an era of the mechanical crowd, a world where blending in is effortless, but the cost is a quiet, profound emptiness. It is the experience of being hyper-connected to everyone while losing any sense of being someone. In the 19th century, Søren Kierkegaard identified this exact social decay. He viewed the mass as a sickness and spent his life acting as the historical antidote. At the center of his work is anxiety, what he called the dizziness of freedom. It is the terrifying weight of standing on a precipice, staring into a void of infinite possibility, and realizing the absolute choice of who to become rests entirely on your shoulders. Most people run from this dizziness, seeking the safety of the group. But Kierkegaard argued that facing this terror is the necessary first step to actually existing. To be an individual, you have to look into the void. Kierkegaard's dark psychology was a lived inheritance, rooted in the trauma of his father's past. In the late 1700s, Michael Kierkegaard was a starving shepherd boy on the windswept heaths of Jutland. Driven by cold and hunger, the young Michael stood on a hill and screamed a curse at God. He eventually escaped poverty and became a wealthy merchant, but he lived in the grip of a single conviction, that he had doomed his bloodline, and that God's wrath would eventually claim his children. Søren was born into the resulting life of privilege in Copenhagen. He was surrounded by the bustling wealth of the mercantile class, but inside his home, the atmosphere was thick with Michael's crushing religious guilt and a fathomless sense of melancholy. The evidence for the curse appeared indisputable. Søren watched his mother and 5 of his 6 siblings die before him. Convinced he would also die by age 33, Søren lived with a morbid, driving urgency. He viewed his life as a countdown, pushing him to complete a massive body of work before the inherited clock ran out. This inescapable dread defined his concept of despair. For Kierkegaard, despair is the default human failure to become one's true self. It is the act of wishing to be someone else, or hiding within the crowd to avoid the responsibility of your own existence. In 1840, Kierkegaard became engaged to Regine Olsen. He was deeply in love, but the engagement immediately triggered a crisis. He realized his internal darkness and religious mission were incompatible with the social requirements of a traditional marriage. He chose to break the engagement to save her from his own melancholy. To ensure she wouldn't be blamed for the split, he orchestrated a public campaign to ruin his own reputation, acting like a callous scoundrel so that society would pity her and move on. He processed this heartbreak through a furious burst of writing, developing his framework of the 3 stages of existence. It maps the difficult ascent from a shallow life to a meaningful one. The base is the aesthetic stage, a life spent chasing pleasure to avoid boredom. Above it is the ethical stage, where we commit to civic duties and social laws. But Kierkegaard found that the ethical life eventually ends in crushing guilt. You cannot reach it through rational argument or civic duty. A void sits between human reason and the absolute. Crossing that gap requires the leap of faith into the absurd. Kierkegaard pointed to Abraham, who was prepared to sacrifice his son because he trusted a divine command that defied all human ethics. Søren saw his own sacrifice of Regine as a parallel, a terrifying step into the unknown. He concluded that true individuality requires this leap. Rational systems and social norms are safe, but they are insufficient for reaching ultimate truth. His rejection of the normal life led to his next collision. In 1845, a satirical magazine called The Corsair began a campaign of relentless public mockery against him. The magazine published cruel caricatures of his appearance and his spindly legs. His daily city walks turned into a gauntlet of harassment. Strangers laughed at him in the street, turning his beloved Copenhagen into a place of trauma. This public humiliation sharpened his sociological critique. He began to view the crowd as a destructive, dehumanizing force. To Kierkegaard, the crowd is where personal responsibility goes to die. It allows people to commit cruelties as a mob that they would never dream of committing as individuals. It is the ultimate tool for avoiding the self. Against this, he set his most famous maxim: truth is subjectivity. Objective truth cannot be found by adopting the majority opinion. It only exists through passionate, inward commitment. Kierkegaard's final battle was his most aggressive. After the death of Bishop Meinster, the Danish state declared the wealthy, comfortable bishop a witness to the truth. Kierkegaard saw this as a mockery of the Christian faith. He argued that Christendom, the state-run church where citizenship was the only requirement, was a forgery. It turned a suffering faith into a comfortable civic ritual. He spent his final months publishing a vitriolic broadside against the church hierarchy. He demanded that people stop attending services, calling for a radical individual honesty over passive institutional attendance. This final exertion was total. At 42, he collapsed in the streets of Copenhagen and died a few weeks later, his life entirely consumed by the struggle to exist as a single individual. His legacy became the foundation of modern existentialism. He influenced the trajectory of psychology and theology by centering everything on the individual's inner life. Kierkegaard's demand remains for us today. We can hide in the anesthesia of the crowd, or we can take absolute, passionate responsibility for our own existence. To exist is to choose.
Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. The most common form of despair is not being who you are. People demand freedom of speech as a compensation for the freedom of thought, which they seldom use. Boredom is the root of all evil. To cheat oneself out of love is the most terrible deception. It is an eternal loss for which there is no reparation, either in time or in eternity. Truth is subjectivity. Prayer does not change God, but it changes him who prays. Faith is the highest passion in a human being. Many in every generation may not come that far, but none comes further. There are two ways to be fooled. One is to believe what isn't true. The other is to refuse to believe what is true.